Hello everybody. 1 second here, there we go. Okay, hello everybody. Ryan here from the Headwaters Science Center. And it is 3:30, which of course means it is time for one of our afternoon STEM shows here at the Headwaters Science Center. Again, my name is Ryan, I'm one of the educators here. And like we do with most of my shows on Fridays, although it's been a couple weeks since I've been the one on camera. We've had a couple of interns doing shows the last couple weeks, and the one I was supposed to do we ended up not doing because we were busy, so it's probably been like almost a month since you guys have seen me. So, glad to be back. Phone's talking to me, 1 second. There we go. And so, like I have historically done, what we're going to be doing is sort of a follow-up show to Lee's Wednesday reading that he did. And so on Wednesday, Lee read 2 books, well, parts of 2 books, read this whole book, and then read a couple little excerpts from this book. And so this one was called The Night Gardener, and this one was called Shrubs and Hedges. Again, both books that he got from the Bemidji Public Library, so you can check those out. And both of what they were kind of about were the idea of like trimming hedges and sort of what that process is and why that works the way it does and yada yada yada. So what happens in The Night Gardener is there is sort of a mysterious gentleman going around in the neighborhood, and he is overnight trimming like trees and shrubs in the neighborhood into sort of fantastical animals, and the boy that the story follows sort of is inspired and takes to trimming hedges himself, basically, is what happens there. Sort of inspires him artistically to take up trimming hedges himself. And then one thing that happens at the end of it that's kind of interesting that I do want to talk a little bit about is that at the end of the story, all of the Night Gardener's topiaries that he makes change. They go from being, these lush green, you got a giraffe and a dinosaur and a whale and a rhino and a bear, and then cut to a few months later, and they're all yellow and red and kind of falling apart a little bit, and then cut to a couple months later again, and all of a sudden we're left with a bunch of branches with no leaves on them at all. So I want to talk a little bit about that process, why trees go from looking lush and green at one part of the year to looking like this over the winter. And then the other one he read was sort of just like a guidebook about like how one should trim your hedges if you have them at your house, or what are good practices for getting the results you want out of doing your hedge trimming. And in particular, the one thing that jumped out to me as like a thing that registered as kind of interesting was it talked a little bit about, like a propensity for shrubs and whatnot to grow back like unevenly, I think is the term it used in here. And there's a lot of text on these. I'm probably not going to find the exact spot that it talked about. But it talked about sort of this tendency for your shrubs, for your hedges, whatever, to grow back in ways that you don't always necessarily want them to, ways that aren't always necessarily like the aesthetic you're trying to establish in your yard. And I was, got me questioning as far as like, why does that happen? What determines what shape a hedge is going to grow back in after you cut it? And so those are the 2 topics I kind of want to talk about a little bit today. And so this one's kind of a fun one. A lot of the times when I'm doing these, like I'm able to take something, use a bunch of knowledge that I just have locked up in here already and do a little quickie presentation about it. This one's kind of a fun one though, because this is genuinely something that I don't have a very strong understanding of. Like I don't do plants primarily. Like I'm an animals guy first and foremost. That's what I do here, and mostly I work with dead animals. Even I work with like bones and things like that is sort of my niche. And so getting an opportunity to learn a little bit more about plants, and me and my 2 interns that I had working on this were having a good time talking after Lee's show yesterday about all these different ideas of ways we could take this, talking about, seed dispersal and flowering and all these things. And like I said, the thing we kind of came to like a understanding on, or a conclusion we sort of came to, was like we recognize like this is a thing we've all seen is like, somebody puts like a camera on a plant over like several weeks and watches it grow, and then you play back the footage really fast and you see the plant kind of squiggling all over the place as it's growing. And so I'm thinking, what's the process of like how does a plant exactly determine where it's going to grow, and how do plants like move? Because you don't just see it like expand out and out and out and out at like a steady rate all in one direction at the same time. It grows in specific directions, and even the stuff that's already grown doesn't always just like stay in one spot. It wiggles around a little bit too. And so that's something that I thought was really interesting, because like as me, like when I think about movement in living things, like my tendency is always to think about, you know, muscles and bones and joints and connective tissue and all these things that plants just like don't have. Like, how does a plant decide that it's going to be pointing this way and then like over time kind of start following and start going this way? How does it decide it's going to do that? And then how does it do it? How does it move? Like I said, they don't have muscles, they don't have bones, they don't have anything that would like facilitate that as far as like thinking of it in the context of like how it works for animals, which I thought was really interesting. And there is one place here at the Science Center where we tend to talk about this a little bit. So if you do come and visit us at the Science Center, we have Critter Corner, and kind of in one of the corners of Critter Corner, side over towards the side where the blue blocks are, you'll find a big tank, a big terrarium that has a bunch of plants in it. And what's special about those plants, there's some of them that are just sort of general bog plants in there, and then there's like a little tank next to it that has a bunch of plants that are still bog plants, but they're sort of a unique type of bog plant. They're plants that are carnivorous. And what carnivorous plants are ones that eat, it's mostly bugs that they eat, but they'll eat kind of anything that's small enough for them to eat, basically. But they have to have a way of doing this. And so a couple of them do like actively like move to catch their food. You know, we have like the ones that we have around Minnesota mostly are pitcher plants that don't like move themselves. They're sort of a static trap that stuff falls into and dies. But there are a couple around here that like actually like catch food, and then you go, you know, sort of broader, more exotic, and there's actually several plants that do like active movement around and for the sake of catching food items. The one that we have around here, and this isn't the exact species, but we have one that's very similar to this, we have the Broadleaf Sundew that lives right around Bemidji, where the Headwaters Science Center is. And so this is another sundew. It's not a broadleaf, but it's a similar sundew. And sundews kind of do this interesting thing where they have, it's going to be tough to pick up on the camera because this one's pretty little. Tough part about carnivorous plants is they tend to be really active in the summer and then sort of bed down the rest of the year. So ours aren't really up yet, but I do have this little sundew that is just kind of re-sprouting for the year. And maybe you can see it on the camera, maybe not, but I'll kind of describe to you. Maybe I can even do a little doodle on the board behind me here. I think I have a marker. Sure do. And so if you were to look at this sundew, what you would see is it's sort of a little, like, club shape is sort of what it looks like, and it's just a bunch of these that are kind of sticking out on the ground. And on the end of the club is almost, it looks like a bunch of little hairs. Is sort of how it looks when you're looking at it. And the way that sundews work is basically you'll get, like I said, a little bug, a little fruit fly or something lands on here, and these hairs have kind of a little sticky to them. And so when something lands on these hairs, it gets stuck, and then when it moves the hairs around, those hairs getting moved around triggers the sundew to start moving. And what the sundew will do is it'll sort of curl up. It'll make like a little curlicue around a food item in the middle, and then it'll start digesting it from there. So that's movement. It's movement that's happening like pretty fast because it's, you know, got to be able to catch this food item and wrap it up before it gets a chance to get away. Excuse me. And so the way that it does this is it takes advantage of like a pretty basic, just like, almost call it like an architecture idea or physics idea, where basically things that are, if you have two things that are connected and you make one of them longer or shorter, it has to, like, curling has to happen. It's the way it's got to work. And so, as an example of that, I have this guy up here with me. And so, what I have here is called a bimetallic strip. And so if we want to do our little, that Latin lesson for the day, bi means two, metallic, made of metal. It's a strip that's made out of two metals. And so in particular, this side here is made of brass, and this side here is made of steel. And what's very different about brass and steel is that they react differently to extreme cold temperatures very differently. In particular, what tends to happen is that brass kind of shrinks really quickly. Steel also shrinks. It also contracts, but it doesn't contract nearly as quickly as the brass does. And so what I have just off camera here, which maybe I'll scooch it in, is a cooler, and inside this cooler I have a bunch of liquid nitrogen. not a bunch, some liquid nitrogen. And so it is, what, negative 320 something degrees inside this cooler. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my bimetallic strip that's relatively straight right now, and I'm going to throw it in here. And like I said, what's going to happen with that is that those two metals that it's made of are going to react differently to being in the cold. In particular, the brass is going to contract a lot more quickly than the steel is. And so we'll just give that a second to keep working in there. And like I said, what we're going to see is the result of that difference in how quickly these two metals contract in just a second here. Go sip of my coffee. Uh-oh. One second. Let it get too deep in there. I can't reach inside and grab it with my fingers, because my fingers can't handle that much cold either. And so, like I said, what you see is our bimetallic strip, like I said, was relatively straight when we put it in the liquid nitrogen, but it's substantially curled over now. Like I said, the brass side is here, the steel side is on this side. And like I said, that's a result of the brass contracts faster than the steel when it gets cold. With plants, it's not relying on warm and cold to be the things that decide what's going to contract and how it's going to contract. What plants use, at least what a sundew uses, is actually moisture. And so when the sundew wants to curl its leaves around a prey item, what it does is it sucks all the water out of certain cells within the plant, and then those cells kind of shrivel up because there's no water in them, and then, like I said, you get the same effect where because one side suddenly gets a lot shorter than the other side, it curls up like that. And that's how the sundew does it. That's also how Venus flytraps do it too. They do the same thing, except just like in the hinges of the little snap trap they have. So they suck all the water out here, those cells shrink, and it closes up. And so that's happening on a pretty quick basis. Like I said, that has to be happening at a rate that is functional for actually catching food. But this is something that plants are kind of doing all the time, is just moving water around within themselves. And this is also how they, like I say, sort of determine which direction they're going to grow in. And so, I'm gonna scooch this off of camera here. Scooch you off of camera here. And I have a couple words written on the board behind me. I don't know if you can read them. But this one says phototropism. This one says geo, and it's also geotropism is what I want to talk about, and then hydrotropism. And so those are three words that are all sort of describing behaviors that plants exhibit. And so phototropism is this tendency to grow towards or grow in response to light. Geotropism is the tendency to grow in response to gravity, and hydrotropism is in response to water. And you can have a positive and a negative form of either of these. You can grow towards light, that's positive phototropism. You can grow away from light, that's negative phototropism. And same goes for all these. But what the tropism is describing is sort of this tendency for plants to react to external stimuli, particularly, like I said in this case, light, gravity, water. And so these are all things that plants need to be concerned about, especially light tends to be the thing we think about it with the most. Because plants obviously take in light, that's where they get their energy from. That's what facilitates photosynthesis, is they need light as the catalyst for that reaction to make their sugars that they then use as the energy to facilitate their growth, yada, yada, yada. But what's really interesting about the phototropism is sort of the mechanism behind it is, like I said, what we were kind of just talking about, where they're moving water around between their cells. But the thing that sort of triggers that, the way that they know where to grow, what direction to grow, how much to grow, is by using this material called auxin, A-U-X-I-N. And auxin is a hormone. And so hormones are chemicals that all living things, as far as I know, make. That basically tell your body to do certain things. They're sort of little, not quite messengers, I guess, but they're instructions, I guess, is what hormones are. Humans make them, all sorts of stuff makes them, plants make them. And what Auxin does, the way Auxin works, we'll talk about it kind of specifically in context of phototropism here, is, so say you have a plant that is sort of deficient in the amount of light it's getting, and it wants to be growing towards more light. And it has all its little shoots that are growing out, it has all its little branches that are growing all sorts of little different directions, and it says, okay, we are getting the most light coming from this way. This is where we're experiencing light the most often. So what the Auxin will do is they'll go into each little shoot off of the plant. So here, let me do this. Bring our friend over. So what you would have is, if, you know, we want this part of the plant to be getting more light. So what we're going to do is, we know that our light is coming from over here. What we're going to do if we're the Auxin is we're going to all move over to this side of the plant. We're going to pile in over here, so that's going to like kind of swell the cells up that are inside the plant over here, which, like we saw with this guy, is going to make it so that it has to curve. And in this case, they're kind of doing it the opposite way, where rather than shrinking a thing, they're expanding a thing. So they all move to one side of the plant, they stretch those cells out, those cells get big and swollen, and then the plant, in response, like I said, has to bend the opposite direction. It curls the opposite way. And then you continue growing as a plant from there. So what the Auxin basically does is it makes cells swell up in certain spots, and that's how they sort of determine where they're going to be growing. That's also, like I said, when they're doing their moving, how they're doing their moving is basically, like I said, by using this Auxin to move water in and out of cells to direct growth a certain direction. And like I said, you can do it, you hear about it the most in terms of light, but like I said, it's done in terms of moisture too. So particularly you'll see this in the roots. The direction the roots grow is the same way. So if they are like, okay, we're getting the most moisture this direction, everyone pile onto that one side and start curving our roots that direction. Gravity is kind of a weird, tricky one. Like, I don't fully understand the way gravity works, because obviously, like, a lot of plants want to grow up, but you also see plants that, you know, do this thing where they grow up and then they droop down. Or you'll see things like vines that are, you know, wrapping around structure, things like that. And honestly, I don't like fully know how that works. I know it is still an Auxin thing, like but I don't necessarily know what the stimulus is for it, like what makes a plant know that it needs to like curl around a thing. I'm not very familiar with that, to be honest. Not going to pretend like I know what I'm talking about with that. But like I said, it's using sort of a similar idea, where it's using Auxin to inflate and deflate cells, basically, to direct growth a certain direction. Okay. The other thing I wanted to talk about a little bit is plant pigments. And so most plants, you know, when you say, you know, picture a plant in your imagination, it probably is this color that you're seeing in front of me. It's probably mostly like green, the plants that you picture, unless you pictured, I don't know, like a fruit of some plant or whatever. But if you say picture a leaf, it's usually going to be green. And leaves are green because of this chemical in them, this pigment called chlorophyll, that they use, again, as part of their like energy collecting process. It's part of the process they use for collecting sunlight and, again, turning it into sugars for energy for the plant. But like we saw in our book over here, plants are not green all the time. They change colors, and eventually, for a lot of the plants at least, they drop their leaves off seasonally. And so we call the trees that do that, those are deciduous trees. So trees that like have leaves, and those are the opposite types of trees would be conifers or evergreen trees. So typically are ones that have needles that stay green all year round for the most part. And so I went outside the Science Center on our balmy, snowy, middle of April day here, and just found a couple leaves that were laying on the sidewalk outside. This oak leaf, and I don't know what this one's from, to be honest, but... And you'll note that they are not very green. They are, in fact, brown. And you'll even see, like, typically you're not going to see, like, brown leaves, like, on a tree either. Usually they're going to be reds or oranges. Typically, if they're this color brown, it means that they've been off the tree for a while. And so what happens when a tree is or when a leaf turns brown is it basically means that all of the pigment in it has broken down to the point where there's none of it left in there. And so the brown is actually, like, the original colors of, like, the cell walls that the leaf is made up of. That's where the brown comes from. But you don't always just see green and brown. There's usually some middle stages in there, and it kind of depends on what kind of tree it is, what colors you see in between there, whether it's yellow or orange or red. And like I said, we usually see those in the fall, or all those different types of colors. And we start seeing them in the fall because what happens in the fall typically is that your days are getting shorter. And when the days start getting shorter, it becomes less worth it for the trees to keep producing chlorophyll. They need to be making chlorophyll all the time. They got to be constantly producing it. And constantly making that new chlorophyll all the time gets expensive after a while. Like, it's not like cheap to make, but they need to use it for their energy. And so they kind of focus on making it during the months where they're going to get the most use out of it. So that ends up being like the spring and summer, when the days are the longest. And then as the days start to shorten, like the equation shifts a little bit, and it's like, I could keep making this, but is the amount of energy it takes to make this chlorophyll actually worth the amount of energy I'm going to get back from it? Probably not. And they quit making it, and as a result, the chlorophyll that's in the trees starts breaking down, and you start seeing other pigments. And so it's kind of a weird thing to think about, is that like with humans, we basically only have one pigment in our body. We have melanin, and it's a brown pigment, and all the different colors of human experiences in their body are basically just different amounts of melanin. But with a lot of other stuff, they make multiple different pigments, and that includes plants. And so trees, most of them, I think, make 4, maybe it's 3 or 4 pigments. But chlorophyll is like the most prominent one, especially in the leaves. And so the green from the chlorophyll ends up dominating them all throughout the spring and summer. And then once it stops making the chlorophyll breaks down relatively quickly, and that's when you start seeing these other colors. Is basically those colors were always there. They just were covered up by chlorophyll, basically. And so when the chlorophyll breaks down, now you start seeing the other pigments that are there and serve other purposes. As far as some of it is like helping absorb light, even as far as, you know, different frequencies of light. Different colors are going to absorb different frequencies of light more efficiently, which still helps with, you know, the photosynthesis process. I know some of it is used for like water retention stuff too, I want to say. Again, it's not something I'm like super deeply familiar with. But basically the reason that you start seeing different colors later on in the year, in the fall, and you said into the winter a little bit, is because the chlorophyll goes away. The chlorophyll is the one that they make far and away the most of. And so the chlorophyll, they quit making it, it goes away. The other pigments become visible. So that's why the trees change color. And then eventually, you know, the days get short to the point, and the trees quit feeding them resources, and eventually they just fall off, and that's why they fall off in the winter. And then, like I said, they'll regrow them in the spring, kind of in preparation for the summer when they're getting the longest days. They'll pump them full of chlorophyll to get all their light, get all their energy, do all their growing. And so in a way, like in the winter, what trees are doing is like hibernating. They're doing the same thing that, you know, a lot of animals do, where they say, hey, resources are real scarce here, so rather than like going out and trying to gather them and probably not gathering as many resources as I need to even like make my excursion out to find them be worth it, I'm just going to go to sleep for a while, conserve what I've got, and hopefully come out the other side okay. So that's basically the way it works for, a lot of animals do it, a lot of plants do it too. That's another kind of interesting bit here is we talked about how not all plants do that. Instead, we have some that we usually will call evergreens. Like I said, they're usually needle and like cone-bearing trees, conifers. And we have a lot of them around here. We have our red pines, our white pines, our jack pines, our various types of firs or spruces. Like we have like all kinds of these different types of various like needly trees and shrubs around here that do keep their, you know, relative greenness year round. And it just so happened that Lee, our executive director, who, you know, he reads to you every Wednesday, was doing some pruning of himself at his house, and I think this is balsam. It looks like a little balsam fir, and you can see, you know, like I said, I went and I got these off the trees in front of the science center, or I guess from on the ground and next to the trees in front of the science center, and they're very, very brown, whereas these little ends that Lee trimmed off of his balsam are still relatively green. Ooh, actually, it's not just balsam that's mixed in here. We have some pine needles that are mixed in here too, and these are kind of brownish. Those must have fallen off earlier, because they are very much brown already. So you can see, even with a, let's see, what is this? Two together. 2 is red pine, right? Correct me if I'm wrong. I think 3 is white pine, 2 is red pine. I might have that backwards. But we have some pine needles here, and so what's interesting is they are brown, just like the leaves were, and so these would be ones that were, fell off of their tree a lot longer ago than what this pile of balsam here did. And so over time, this balsam will turn brown too, and you're already seeing it on the ends a little bit. This pile of balsam will turn brown too as the chlorophyll in the needles breaks down. And like I said, you'll see that right there in a different, call it an evergreen, but like I said, after it dies, after it's disconnected from the plant, it turns brown just like the leaves on the deciduous ones do. Because it's all relying on the same process, they just don't go through the seasonality the same way that the deciduous trees do. What else we got? Oh, I guess something that's kind of cool. You can see with this plant that I have next to me here is that it is, more planty on different sides of it. Like you can look at it and you can see it's pretty lush on this side, but you turn the back to it and there's kind of a big bald spot back here. And so you can think about this and you can probably guess where this plant was, or what direction the light was coming from for this plant when it was, before I brought it up here for the show. And so this is a plant that you can see if you come and visit us at the Science Center. This plant lives in the front entryway. And basically, the side that is the bald spot is the side that faces into the Science Center. And so the side that over here that has all the greenery on it is the side that faces out the front windows of the Science Center. So even just within the Science Center, we have this plant that has been growing directionally. It's been doing exactly what we were talking about earlier, where it's like, hey, there's light coming from like one specific direction for me. I got to grow that way to get that light. And so, like I said, you can see a bunch of greenery on this side, the side that was facing out the windows, pretty much nothing on the other side, the side that was facing into the Science Center. And so, like I said, that's a great example of the phototropism that plants exhibit. Again, relying on the hormone Auxin to do so. Headwaters Science Center is open 7 days a week. We are open Monday through Saturday from 9:30 to 5. We're open Sundays from 1 to 5. We do these shows periodically, or we're going to be slowing them down and potentially like full-on stopping them here in a little bit. Sort of, we're going to keep on the schedule we've been on for the last little while, like through the end of May, or through the end of April, sorry. And then into May, we're probably going to stop them for a little while, other than maybe special occasions here and there, and then probably pick them back up in the fall. We're just getting towards our busy season here, and it's going to be harder for us to maintain a schedule, so we're just kind of being like, eh. So, a couple more shows, like I said, going through the end of April, but after that. Otherwise, if you want to come and visit us, we do these shows currently Wednesday and Friday consistently, and then usually one more show either on a Saturday, Sunday, Monday, somewhere in there, at least one. Swing by at about 3:30, and I'm always happy to have a live audience for mine. I know Lee is always happy to have a live audience for his too. Had a couple people move in and out here. You might have seen me waving at folks as they were coming by. But anyways, thank you all for watching, and we will see you